Hi, I'm Bethany Slack, and this is my oral testimony. I'm one of those lucky white American kids who was born into a Christian family who was involved in my life and took me to church 2-3 times a week. Both of my sides of the family have been Christians for generations. I was just destined to a life of grace. But just because you know what's right and wrong, and you know who Jesus is, doesn't mean you'll effectively carry out the actions you're meant to. My uncle's been my pastor for almost my whole life, and I was saved and baptized at the age of 4. Things went by in a blur, and I really don't remember much of my past. But I do remember in all of that salvation, I was a terrible, bad kid. My mom and dad spanked me daily, very literally. I remember being put in detention twice in just 2nd grade. The first was because an extremely obnoxious little boy kept calling me Minnie Mouse at lunch, and I slapped him. What else are you supposed to do to annoying boys who call you names? The other time involved that same unlucky boy who borrowed my scissors. Really, he was stealing, right? So I pried his fingers off of my scissors until he cried. I have to say I felt justified in all my actions, but guilt pervaded, as it usually does, into my human mind. As I grew up and we moved, I became more self-concerned rather than Jesus' love concerned. It was never a point where I chose to be like my sinful self, but more of a process. I realized that I did need a savior, because I was a pretty bad person. Besides, who doesn't want to go to heaven? I questioned my faith and recommitted at age 8. Yet this too seemed to grow old fast. I attended church and heard every story, but somehow it seemed too hard to get it right. By the time I was in high school, morals and ethics became opinion, and everything I wanted tended to go against what my parents insisted. By the end of that 4-year term of high school, my cousin and her husband came to my church to be my youth pastor. They had graduated from BBC and quickly became my favorite people. They were cool, young, hip, and just old enough that they could be super cool and still my friends. I spent what seemed like every day over at their house. Eventually, they pushed me into the leadership in the youth group. This was when faith started showing fruit in my life. I knew that I was saved, I just hardly had acted like it. I was beginning to understand what patience felt like, how forgiving others could set you free, and so much more. I read my Bible, prayed, grew, and ultimately felt the peace of God. Over the years, sin creeps back in, and you have to remember that we will always be human. If I don't daily die to myself and ask God to forgive me for all the things I mess up on, I really can't go anywhere but backwards. It's taken a long time to understand and put into action that faith which doesn't depend on actions or tasks, but on a relationship with Jesus Christ who died to save me. It doesn't get easier to be better, but I can see myself change as I stop filling myself with me and my desires, and instead fill up with God and His plans and promises for me. In keeping with this mindset, I've tasted and seen that God is great, and I want to tell others about that. I really struggle with the fear of actually professing my faith to those who I want to approve of me, so this is something that I'll have to grow in. I surrendered to ministry my junior year of high school at church camp. I'd always loved traveling in other cultures and thought that if God could use me in another country, well, I'd sure be on my way. This led into dreams of hacking through brush in Africa and camping in jungles with indigenous peoples. But as I've grown in understanding of the 20th century missions, I'm visualizing a world in which the iPhone thrives and internet penetrates into the jungles. Even though I'd surrendered to ministry, my fleshly self found ways of justifying ways around it. I decided to go to a Christian college and get my degree in some sort of global studies or international affairs. This all seemed like I was doing what I really wanted, but still appeasing the promise I'd made to God years prior. I enrolled in a college far away from my family where I could achieve all of my wildest dreams and capture my adventurous independence and then bottle it into success. But after a summer spent seeking the will of God, my conscience told me that I had been feeding my desires, not seeking to fulfill God's. A few short weeks before school started, I switched enrollment to BBC and sought out a degree in missions. As I've gone through the preparatory process, I've wavered in my promise to God. Not physically, but mentally I've doubted this plan in my life. But I know that ultimately this is how I've discerned God's will for me, and if my heart is on Him, seeking to fulfill the desires of His heart, He can use me beyond what I feel I'm useful. I used to think that God had pressed Asia upon my heart. I'm still not sure that He hasn't, but this summer I'm seeking out Europe. I don't know exactly where or what God has planned for me after I'm done with school. I just know I'm going to keep seeking Him until I find out.